Today, we're diving deep into a profound philosophical idea. Life is not about finding yourself, but creating yourself. Inspired by the principles of Stoicism, we'll explore how to take charge of our lives and shape our destiny. Let's embark on this transformative journey together. Step 1. Define your values. To create yourself, you must first understand what truly matters to you. This step involves identifying your core values. Stoics believe in virtues like wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Values are the bedrock of your character and the foundation upon which you build your life. Without clear values, you may find yourself drifting aimlessly, making choices that lead to dissatisfaction and regret. Begin by reflecting on moments in your life when you felt truly fulfilled. What were you doing? Who were you with? What values were being honored in those moments? Perhaps you were helping a friend in need, demonstrating compassion, or working diligently on a project, exemplifying perseverance. These instances can provide insights into your core values. Next, consider the people you admire and respect. What qualities do they embody that you find inspiring? These qualities often align with your own values. For example, if you admire someone for their integrity and honesty, these may be values you hold dear as well. Write down a list of potential values, and then narrow it down to your top 5. These should be values that resonate deeply with you, that you aspire to embody in your daily life. It's important to be honest with yourself during this process. Don't choose values based on what you think others expect of you or what seems socially acceptable. Choose values that truly reflect your authentic self. Once you have your top 5 values, think about how they can guide your decisions and actions. For instance, if one of your values is courage, how can you incorporate more courage into your life? It might mean speaking up for what you believe in, taking risks in pursuit of your dreams, or facing your fears head-on. Remember, defining your values is not a one-time exercise. It's an ongoing process. As you grow and evolve, your values may shift and change. Periodically revisit your list of values to ensure they still align with who you are and who you want to become. Let these values serve as your compass, guiding you through life's challenges and uncertainties. When faced with difficult decisions, refer back to your values. Ask yourself, which choice aligns with my values? Which path reflects the person I want to be? This practice will help you stay true to yourself and create a life of integrity and purpose. Finally, share your values with those close to you. Discussing your values with friends and family can provide additional clarity and support. It also holds you accountable to living in alignment with your values. These values will serve as your compass, guiding your decisions and actions. Embrace them fully and let them shape the foundation of your journey. Step 2. Set clear goals. Once your values are clear, it's time to set goals that align with them. Goals give you direction and purpose. Think of both short-term and long-term objectives. Clear goals are like roadmaps, providing you with a sense of direction and a destination to strive for. Without goals, it's easy to feel lost and unmotivated. Begin by setting long-term goals that reflect your values and aspirations. These are the big, overarching objectives that you want to achieve over the course of several years. For example, if one of your values is wisdom, a long-term goal might be to attain a certain level of education or become an expert in your field. Break down your long-term goals into smaller, more manageable short-term goals. These are the stepping stones that will help you reach your larger objectives. For instance, if your long-term goal is to write a book, a short-term goal might be to write 1 chapter per month. Make sure your goals are smart, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. This framework ensures that your goals are clear and attainable. For example, instead of setting a vague goal like get in shape, set a specific goal like run a 5K within 3 months. Write your goals down and place them somewhere visible, such as a bulletin board or your phone's home screen. This constant visual reminder will keep you focused and motivated. It's also helpful to create a detailed action plan for each goal. List the specific steps you need to take and set deadlines for each step. Regularly review your progress and adjust your goals as needed. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes you may need to adapt your goals to changing circumstances. That's perfectly okay. The important thing is to stay flexible and committed to your overall vision. Celebrate your achievements along the way, no matter how small they may seem. Acknowledging your progress boosts your confidence and motivation. It also reinforces the positive habits and behaviors that contribute to your success. Seek support and accountability from others. Share your goals with friends, family, or a mentor who can provide encouragement and feedback. Joining a group or community with similar goals can also be incredibly motivating. Remember, setting goals is not just about achieving specific outcomes. It's about personal growth and development. The journey towards your goals teaches you valuable lessons and shapes you into the person you want to become. Finally, be patient and persistent. Creating yourself is a lifelong journey, not a race. There will be setbacks and challenges along the way, but each obstacle is an opportunity to learn and grow. Stay focused on your values and keep moving forward. Short-term goal: read a book on Stoic philosophy this month. Long-term goal: live a life that reflects your core values consistently. These goals align with the value of wisdom and provide a clear direction for personal growth. Step 3. Embrace self-discipline. Creating yourself requires discipline. Stoicism teaches us to control our impulses and remain steadfast in our efforts. Daily habits and routines are crucial. Discipline is the bridge between goals and achievement. It's what enables you to stay committed to your values and goals, even when the going gets tough. Start by identifying areas in your life where you lack discipline. This could be anything from procrastinating on important tasks to neglecting your physical health. Once you've identified these areas, create a plan to address them. Set specific, achievable targets and establish a routine that supports these targets. Developing self-discipline often involves making small, incremental changes to your daily habits. For example, if you struggle with maintaining a consistent exercise routine, start by committing to just 10 minutes of exercise each day. Gradually increase the duration as you build the habit. Mindfulness and meditation are powerful tools for cultivating self-discipline. These practices help you become more aware of your thoughts and impulses, allowing you to respond to them with intention rather than reacting automatically. Spend a few minutes each day in quiet reflection or meditation to strengthen your self-awareness and focus. Another key aspect of self-discipline is managing your environment. Create an environment that supports your goals and minimizes distractions. This might mean organizing your workspace, limiting your exposure to social media, or surrounding yourself with people who inspire and motivate you. Accountability is also crucial. Share your goals and progress with a trusted friend or mentor who can hold you accountable. Regular check-ins and feedback can provide additional motivation and help you stay on track. Be kind to yourself and practice self-compassion. Building self-discipline is challenging, and it's normal to experience setbacks. Instead of being overly critical, use these moments as opportunities to learn and grow. Reflect on what went wrong, adjust your approach, and try again. Remember that self-discipline is not about rigidly controlling every aspect of your life. It's about making conscious choices that align with your values and goals. It's about having the inner strength to stay true to yourself, even when faced with temptations and distractions. Celebrate your successes and acknowledge your progress. Each small victory builds your confidence and reinforces the positive behaviors that contribute to your growth. Over time, these small victories add up to significant progress. Finally, embrace the journey of self-discipline as a continuous process of self-improvement. There will always be areas where you can grow and develop. Stay committed to your values, keep setting and achieving goals, and remember that the effort you put into building self-discipline is an investment in your future. Start small. Incorporate habits that support your goals and values. Over time, these will build a disciplined and resilient character. Step 4. Learn and adapt. Life is a constant learning process. The Stoics valued wisdom and continuous improvement. Seek knowledge, learn from your experiences, and adapt to new situations. Embracing a mindset of lifelong learning keeps you open to new possibilities and ensures that you continue to grow and evolve. Start by cultivating a habit of reading and seeking out new information. Read books, articles, and research papers on topics that interest you and align with your goals. Consider setting aside dedicated time each day for reading and learning. This habit not only expands your knowledge, but also keeps your mind sharp and engaged. Learning isn't limited to formal education or reading. You can learn from your experiences and the experiences of others. Reflect on your past experiences, both successes and failures. What lessons can you draw from them? How can you apply these lessons to future situations? Engage with a diverse range of perspectives and ideas. Seek out conversations with people from different backgrounds and with different viewpoints. This exposure broadens your understanding and helps you see the world from different angles. Stay curious and ask questions. Curiosity is the driving force behind learning and discovery. Whenever you encounter something new or unfamiliar, ask questions and seek to understand it more deeply. Embrace challenges and view them as opportunities for growth. When you encounter obstacles or setbacks, approach them with a problem-solving mindset. What can you learn from this experience? How can you improve and move forward? Consider seeking out mentors or role models who can provide guidance and insight. Learning from those who have walked the path before you can accelerate your growth and help you avoid common pitfalls. Practice adaptability by staying open to change and willing to adjust your plans. The world is constantly changing, and flexibility is essential for navigating these changes successfully. When faced with unexpected circumstances, adapt your approach and remain focused on your goals. Document your learning journey. Keep a journal or log where you record your insights, reflections, and progress. This practice helps you internalize what you've learned and provides a valuable resource to refer back to. Finally, share your knowledge and experiences with others. Teaching and mentoring others not only reinforces your own learning but also contributes to the growth and development of those around you. Every setback is an opportunity for growth. Reflect on what went wrong and how you can do better next time. This mindset of continuous learning and adaptation is essential for creating yourself. Step 5. Cultivate gratitude and presence. Stoicism teaches us to appreciate the present moment and be grateful for what we have. This mindset helps you stay grounded and focused on what truly matters. Gratitude and presence are powerful tools for cultivating a positive and resilient mindset. Begin by incorporating a daily gratitude practice into your routine. Each day, take a few moments to reflect on the things you are grateful for. This could be anything from the support of a loved one to the beauty of a sunset. Write these reflections in a gratitude journal to reinforce the habit. Practicing mindfulness is another effective way to cultivate presence. Mindfulness involves paying attention to the present moment without judgment. This practice helps you stay focused on the here and now, rather than getting lost in regrets about the past or worries about the future. Engage in activities that promote mindfulness and presence. This could include meditation, yoga, or simply spending time in nature. These activities help you connect with your surroundings and appreciate the beauty of the present moment. Limit distractions and create a conducive environment for mindfulness. Turn off unnecessary notifications, designate specific times for checking emails and social media, and create a quiet space for reflection and relaxation. Practice gratitude in your interactions with others. Express appreciation and thankfulness for the people in your life and the positive contributions they make. This not only strengthens your relationships but also reinforces a mindset of gratitude. Focus on the positive aspects of your experiences, even in challenging situations. Look for silver linings and lessons that can be learned. This practice helps you maintain a positive outlook and builds resilience in the face of adversity. Remember that cultivating gratitude and presence is an ongoing practice. It's easy to get caught up in the busyness of life and lose sight of the present moment. Regularly remind yourself to slow down, breathe, and appreciate the here and now. Reflect on your day before going to bed. Consider what went well, what you are grateful for, and how you can improve. This reflection helps you end the day on a positive note and sets the stage for a mindful and grateful approach to the next day. Share your gratitude practice with others. Encourage friends and family to join you in reflecting on the things they are grateful for. This shared practice can strengthen bonds and create a supportive community. Finally, be patient with yourself as you cultivate gratitude and presence. It takes time to develop these habits, but with consistent practice, they can become a natural part of your daily life. Every day, write down a few things you're grateful for. This practice cultivates a positive and resilient mindset. Step 6. Serve others. A key aspect of creating yourself is contributing to the well-being of others. Stoics believed in the interconnectedness of humanity and the importance of service. Serving others not only benefits those you help but also enriches your own life. Begin by identifying ways you can contribute to your community. This could involve volunteering at a local charity, participating in community events, or simply offering support to those in need. Look for opportunities that align with your values and interests. Consider the impact of your actions on others. Small acts of kindness can make a significant difference in someone's life. Whether it's offering a listening ear, providing a helping hand, or sharing your knowledge and skills, every act of service counts. Reflect on the ways you can use your unique talents and abilities to serve others. Think about what you are passionate about and how you can use your strengths to make a positive impact. For example, if you have a talent for teaching, consider volunteering to tutor students or lead workshops. Engage in random acts of kindness. These spontaneous gestures can brighten someone's day and create a ripple effect of positivity. Pay for a stranger's coffee, leave a kind note for a coworker, or simply smile and greet people warmly. Seek out opportunities for collaborative service. Working with others towards a common goal can amplify the impact of your efforts and build a sense of community. Join groups or organizations that focus on causes you care about and contribute your time and energy. Remember that service is not just about grand gestures. It's about the everyday actions that demonstrate care and compassion for others. Hold the door open, offer a word of encouragement, or take the time to listen to someone who needs to talk. Reflect on the impact of your service on your own well-being. Serving others can provide a sense of purpose, fulfillment, and connection. It reminds you of the interconnectedness of humanity and reinforces the value of compassion and empathy. Encourage others to join you in acts of service. Share your experiences and inspire those around you to contribute to the well-being of others. This collective effort can create a culture of kindness and support within your community. Finally, remember that serving others is a continuous practice. Look for new ways to contribute and stay committed to making a positive impact. Every act of service, no matter how small, contributes to the creation of a better world. Find ways to give back to your community. Acts of kindness and service enrich your life and create a positive impact on the world. By defining your values, setting goals, embracing self-discipline, continuously learning, cultivating gratitude, and serving others, you can truly create yourself. Remember, the journey is ongoing, and every step you take shapes the person you become. Thank you for joining us today. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. Together, let's create a life of purpose and meaning. Until next time, stay strong and keep growing.